All right, we always like to start on time. We're going to start a little bit early. So my name is Derek Mosley. I'm the director of Marquette Law School's Lubar Center for Public Policy Research and Civic Education. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to our Get to Know program. For those of you who are new to the Get to Know program, it's sort of like a piece of my childhood. When I was growing up in Chicago, there was a reporter by the name of Harry Porterfield in Chicago. His granddaughter, actually, Amanda Porterfield, is at Channel 58 here in Milwaukee. But he used to do this special called People You Should Know. And I used to love to watch it with my parents because I learned about things going on in the city and in the country that I wasn't aware of. And it gave me like unfettered access to things I couldn't be a part of. And so I wanted to take this just a little step further. So I kind of wanted to try a new thing that we call the face of the case. So I wanted to marry the two together. And so, Dean, where you at? That's from the dean. That was from the dean. So, when we talk about cases, whether you're a law student or a law professor or even just a regular citizen, we always talk in terms of the names. We always talk in terms of the names. And so, like the classic example, everybody here knows when you get arrested by the police, you are read your Miranda rights. And people don't understand often that that comes from a case. That's Miranda versus Arizona is the case. Ernesto Miranda was a real person. And we refer to it as Miranda all the time. We don't say Arizona versus Miranda. We call it Miranda all the time. And the most recent case that the Dobbs decision, the decision which said that there's no constitutional right to abortion, we call that the Dobbs decision or the Dobbs case, even though it's Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. We always use these names, but we don't talk about the person behind the names. And so that's why we wanted to do this face of the case so that you get to actually see the people that we read about every day in our daily lives. So whether you are a law student, whether you're a law professor in class or a law student reading the cases, or you're sitting by the water cooler. First of all, do people sit by water coolers anymore? But if you sit by the water cooler and talk, right? And so I wanted to bring somebody here from a case that's probably one of the most historic cases, at least of my lifetime. And I want to introduce you to him today. I don't want to go into his background yet. We're going to do that in the interview. But it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Jim Obergefell. Go ahead.
Thank you, Derek. I am thrilled to be here. And I told Derek last night that law audiences are often my favorite, especially in a law school. And it goes back to exactly the point of this program. I love when law students come up to me and it's like they want to touch me. They're like, wait, you're real. I know your case. I know all about it. I've read it, but oh my God, you're a live person. And I love that. So I'm thrilled to be here.
So I got to tell this story. So I'm going to stand for this story. So I'm picking up Jim from the airport, and I've gone through all this information to figure out who he is, and I've never met him. And I'm in the concourse by the baggage, and I see him down there, and I'm like jumping up and down trying to get his attention. And as he comes up, I'm like, I froze because I'm like, you're Jim Obergefell. And so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So Jim, let's start real quick. So you were born and raised in Sandusky, Ohio, correct?
Correct.
So tell me, what is it about Sandusky? Because you were born there, you left, you've traveled all over the world, but then you've come back to Sandusky. Talk to me.
Yeah, born and raised in Sandusky, the baby of 6 in a blue-collar Catholic family. And I left to attend University of Cincinnati, and I stayed away. And over time, after John died, I just realized I missed my family. I missed that connection that I feel in my hometown. And I moved back. And for me, it's really been a treat because all 5 of my siblings are still in the area. I'm the baby, so they're not going to be around forever. So it was my chance really to be able to spend more time with them. And there's just something about hometown. You know, I love that I can go out to breakfast with the friend I've had since the age of 4, Kay. We grew up on the same street. Actually, I was 3 when we met. And I shared this with Derek this morning. We still joke that she claims credit for turning me gay because she kissed me when I was 4 or 5 years old. So it was truly family. And missing that connection, you know, when John died, I lost my family, who was with me everywhere I went. So that was really a big draw for me to go home. And I'm happy there.
So let's speak about that. So it's 1992, and you meet John Arthur, right?
Yep.
And I love this picture of you two. Look at that. You got the
know.
Christopher Reeves going. So I got to tell you this story. So I had that same, so when I was in college, I shaved my head and I had that one little Christopher Reeve thing just like you did. So tell me how you met.
Okay, so I love this. So the first time I met John, I was still teaching high school German, and I was deep in the closet. And this was the spring of 1992. And I went out with a friend, my friend Kevin, and we went to this bar across the street from the University of Cincinnati, where we had both graduated. And we walk in, and Kevin says, "Oh, there's my friend John sitting at the bar. Here's John, this tall, slender, blonde man, drinking a gin and tonic. We meet for the first time, and he terrified me." He was comfortable in his skin as an out gay man, and I thought for sure he's going to call me out. He's going to know I'm gay, but he didn't. So I quit my job and went to graduate school, and that summer in graduate school is when I finally came out. And I was back in Cincinnati for a visit, newly out, and I went out with the same friend Kevin. We went back to that same bar, and one guess who was once again drinking a gin and tonic at the bar? But John. So we met a second time. And during that conversation, John said, "Well, Jim, you'd never go out with someone like me." And I have no idea where this comes from. Here I was newly out, figuring out my way in life. And my response to that was, "Well, how do you know? You've never asked." And the jerk didn't take the hint.
I'm up here, I'm like sweating. I'm so nervous sitting next to you. This is overwhelming for me, but go ahead.
So that was probably July of 1992. Later that year, I was back in Cincinnati for the holidays, and my friend Kevin at this point had become one of John's housemates. And Kevin said, "We're having a New Year's Eve party at John's house. Why don't you come over?" So I went to John's house, and I never left. John liked to say for us, it wasn't love at first sight, it was love at third sight. And 7 weeks later, he gave me a diamond ring.
Oh. All right. So all this is going on. No. So all this is going on, but did you guys ever talk about marriage?
Oh yeah, I would say within, at most, 18 months in our relationship, we talked about marriage, and it was something we wanted. We wanted to be able to get married, but we also agreed, we had friends who were having ceremonies, symbolic ceremonies, and we agreed that wasn't acceptable for us. We wanted marriage and everything that came with it.
But what do you mean by, why was it a symbolic ceremony?
Because same-sex marriage wasn't possible anywhere in the country. So our friends who had ceremonies, it was purely just a symbolic ceremony where they stood in front of their family and friends and said, "This is the person I choose for the rest of my life." But it carried no legal weight. And we weren't interested in that. We wanted marriage and everything that came with it. So we just assumed this is never going to happen.
But while this is going on, and you say it's never going to happen because of DOMA, right?
Well, this is pre-DOMA. It just was the state of queer rights in the
Ohio.
90s. Okay. In Ohio, but nationwide. I mean, there was nowhere in the United States we could get married. I mean, there was a case that popped up in Hawaii in the mid-90s, and we thought, oh, looks like Hawaii might actually legalize same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
And John's stepmother at the time said, "Well, if that happens, I'm taking everybody to Hawaii so you can get married." But of course, that did not come to pass.
Gotcha.
So we just thought, this is never going to happen. But we built our life together, and our family and friends considered us married. We considered ourselves married.
So you're going on and having your relationship with John, and there's this couple in New York, DOMA passes. So for those of you who don't know, the Defense of Marriage Act, basically, it outlined three really big things. One, marriage is between one man and one woman. It also said that if one state honored, gave gays the right to marry, no other state had to respect that law. And then probably one of the most important is no federal benefits, no insurance benefits, no Social Security benefits for surviving spouses. And so that's going on. And there's another couple, and that couple is Edie and Thea, right? And they're in New York. And basically what happens is Thea, so Edie's on the left, if you're looking at the picture up there. On the right is Thea, and Thea actually dies. And Edie tried to get benefits as a result of this. And, well, actually, they were actually taxing her. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were billing her for estate tax.
Yep.
Yeah. And so she said, well, I'm exempt because I'm spouse. And they said, well, no, you're not a spouse, even though they had gotten married in New York.
Canada.
Was it in Canada?
Yeah,
okay.
In Toronto.
And they said no. Mm-hmm. And so she had to pay this large sum of money. So they sue. Mm-hmm. And that case is United States versus Windsor. So that's going on. So do you know Edie then?
No, we knew the Windsor case was happening because, we followed the news. And, this was 2013 when her case went to the Supreme Court. And we were, of course, following it. Not so much even thinking, oh, well, this is our chance to get married. I don't think we ever really made that connection that, oh, well, depending on how this goes, this could be something that helps us. It was more just following progress for queer rights. So we absolutely knew it was happening, but I had never met Edie, and we just were following the case like I think almost every other queer person in the United States was.
And then 2011 happens. And then when 2011 happens, John gets sick, right?
Yeah.
And he's actually diagnosed with ALS.
Correct.
Now, what did you see this? Well, what gave you the indication something was wrong?
Yeah, so early that year, I noticed when John was walking around our condo, his walk sounded different. And that seems like a really weird thing, but when you've been with someone at that point, 19 years, you pick up on small things. And it just sounded like one foot was slapping the floor harder than the other. So I asked him about it, thinking he had pulled a muscle, maybe sprained an ankle, but he hadn't. And this slapping noise didn't go away. And I finally convinced him, John, you've got to go to the doctor. So he went to our family doctor. That turned into lots of medical tests, specialist visits. And in June of 2012, I always lose track of the time frame here. Must have been June of 2012. I was working at the Kitchen Island, and he came home from seeing his third neurologist. And he walked in and said, Jim, this neurologist concurs. It's ALS. And I jump up and I'm hugging him because he had told me he did not want me to go to that appointment with him. And as I'm hugging him, he starts to cry. And I have to say, in the year and a half left in his life, that was the only time I ever saw him cry over this diagnosis. But he finished crying, and then he said, Jim, we're going to have to make some changes. He was already thinking of the future and thinking about me, not himself. And he said, we can't stay in this condo, because our condo was 2 levels in an old factory. So he's like, Jim, I'm not going to be able to get around in this building very easily, so we need to find somewhere new. And when we buy a new place, don't you dare put my name on the deed. He's like, I don't want you to have any troubles, any issues when I die. So he was already thinking more about me than he was himself.
And in 2012, things kind of took a turn for the worse, and he had to be in-home hospice, correct?
Yeah, so his ALS progressed pretty quickly. That diagnosis was like June of 2012, and he started using a cane, then a walker, then a manual wheelchair, and then in April of 2013, we made the decision to start hospice care. And John really did not want to go into a facility, and I wasn't willing to put him in a facility because I had no idea how he'd be treated. Right. How would this out gay man be treated by the caregivers? So we decided to do at-home hospice care, and we found a great service. Actually, this will sound weird, but his mom's boyfriend's girlfriend, his mom had passed away, so she was the executive director of a hospice service. So we had that connection. We were able to talk with her, and we started at-home hospice care because I wanted to be the one who took care of him. And I was for 24/7, other than about 5 hours a week when the hospice nurses visited.
Okay, and then I'm going to take you to June 26th, 2013. Mm-hmm. And I want everybody to remember that date, June 26, 2013. So it's June 26, 2013, you're in the house, John calls you into the room.
Yep. He called me into his room, and he wanted me to be there because news was coming out from the Supreme Court on the Windsor decision. And as I'm standing there holding his hand, next to his bed, the news is released that with their decision in United States versus Windsor, the Supreme Court struck down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act. And as I'm leaning over hugging John, it hits me, wait, the federal government has to recognize same-sex. John, let's get married.
Just like that.
Just like that. We hadn't talked about it. We hadn't even thought about it. But when I realized, wait, what we've wanted since the mid-90s to be seen by our government as a married couple, here's our chance. Yeah. And I just spontaneously said, let's get married. And luckily, he said yes.
But that's not an easy thing to do, right? Because John, it's hard for him to be transported anywhere. It's hard for him to travel. So, and not to mention the fact, you just don't walk into somewhere and say, we have to get married. You specifically picked a location to get married. Can you tell us why you did that?
Yeah, so I started to research where we could get married, and I was looking at New York, Massachusetts, other places, and then a friend of mine who was from Maryland said, well, Jim, have you looked at Maryland? And I hadn't at that point, so I switched to Maryland. And Maryland does one thing that made our planning and our marriage so much easier. You know, my whole goal was, I want to make sure I keep John safe and comfortable. And Maryland is the only state where they don't require both people to appear in person to apply for a marriage license. They allow one person to appear and to sign an affidavit saying, I'm applying for this marriage license with full knowledge and agreement of this other person. And I thought, well, this does it. I can get the marriage license while John stays at home, safe and comfortable. And then all we have to do is figure out how we get the two of us to Maryland to get married.
Which is no easy task.
No easy task.
So how does this happen? So you got to get there somehow. And driving's not going to really be an option.
Right. Sure, I could have put him in his wheelchair and taken our wheelchair minivan. That would have killed him. Same thing with being in an ambulance. And I also couldn't go to the Cincinnati airport and fly domestic. I mean, John had no abilities. I mean, at this point, he could move his right hand a little bit, and he could speak a sentence or two. That was it. No other abilities. So really, a chartered medical jet was our only option. And with the help of our hospice service, we started getting quotes. And it was something we could afford. But at one point, I thought, well, maybe connections can help mitigate the cost. So I went to Facebook, the only positive thing I will ever say about Facebook. And I posted saying that John and I were going to go to Maryland to get married. We had to charter a medical jet. And does anyone have a contact? I thought maybe somebody would know a pilot or somebody with one of these charter companies. And the most amazing thing happened. Our family and friends started posting, no, Jim, sorry, we can't help you. We don't know anyone. But you and John deserve to get married, and we want to help make it happen. So please accept this gift of money. And our family and friends covered the entire $14,000 cost of the chartered medical jet.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
Remarkable. So now you have the jet. You can fly to Maryland and get married, but then you need an officiant. And you didn't know me, so you have to find somebody else to perform the wedding for you. So you need an officiant. So what did you guys decide on that?
Well, that was a really easy decision, which we had that settled. As soon as John said yes, I made a phone call. Years previously, John's Aunt Paulette, his dad's sister, she was John's favorite relative. She was that relative he could turn to, that person who loved him unconditionally. You know, parents are supposed to. They don't always. And John's dad certainly did not love John unconditionally. But she was that person, that family member John and his brother could go to anytime for anything. They still refer to her as his brother still does. Paulette, their Aunt Paulette, Aunt Tootie's her nickname, they considered her their Auntie Mame. And she said, John, Jim, you guys, in my opinion, represent marriage better than any other couple I know. And if you can ever get married, I would love to be the one to do it. So Aunt Tootie went to the internet. This was probably early 2000s, and she clicked the Ordain Me button because she wanted to be ready if she could ever officiate our wedding. So after John said yes, I picked up that phone and called her and said, Tootie, do you remember that offer to officiate a wedding? Does it still stand? And she said, absolutely. Nothing would prevent me from doing this.
So you, John, and Aunt Tootie get on this plane, and you have the wedding.
We have the wedding. You know, we flew to BWI Airport. We parked in the tarmac, and we never left the airplane. And I got to take John's hand, and we got to say those words we had wanted to say for so long. I thee wed. And I think a lot of people, when they learn of a couple who's been together for decades and then get married, they think, well, why? What's it change? It changed everything. We felt different. We felt better. We felt more complete. It really was the happiest moment of our life together. And then we flew home, and that was it. We had no intention of doing anything else. We just wanted to get married. We wanted to live out John's remaining days as husband and husband.
Yeah.
But then, because of that Facebook post, something else happened. A friend who worked for the Cincinnati Enquirer reached out and said, hey, I'm trying to get the paper to come out and support a marriage equality. What would you say about me writing a story about your trip to Maryland and your efforts to get married? We trusted her. We liked her. We said, okay. So that photograph was taken by the photographer she sent from the newspaper to meet us in BWI. And that story came out 2 days after we got married on the internet.
Wow. And so, and if you want to, you can go to the Cincinnati Enquirer site. It's on, and you can see the ceremony, actually. I don't know if you knew that. You could actually.
Oh, I do. Okay. I can't watch it, but I know it's there.
Yeah. So,
I mean, I could watch it. I'd be a complete and utter wreck if I did.
Oh, yeah. So it's 5 days after the wedding, and you meet a lawyer.
Yep.
Yeah, tell us about this lawyer.
So that story that came out online on Saturday, 2 days after we got married, other friends were at a party. They ran into their friend, Al Gerhardstein, who's a civil rights attorney in Cincinnati. And he's been fighting for civil rights now for more than 50 years. And he knew nothing about us. So they shared our story. And he actually left the party without telling his wife and went to his office and rifled through his filing cabinet looking for one specific piece of paper. When he found it, he reached out through those mutual friends to say, John and Jim, I would love to come over and talk with you. So 5 days after we got married, he came to our home. And he pulled out that sheet of paper he looked for and found in his filing cabinet, a blank Ohio death certificate. And he said, now, do you guys get it? When John dies, his last record as a person, his Ohio death certificate will be wrong. Because even though you got married and the federal government recognizes your marriage, Ohio still has the state-level Defense of the Marriage Act on the books. When they fill this out, here where it says marital status at time of death, they're going to say John was unmarried. And here where it says surviving spouse name, Jim, your name won't be there. It broke our hearts. I mean, we knew Ohio wouldn't recognize our marriage, but that was abstract. Here's this very important last record of a person's life, and to find out that that was going to be wrong, it broke our hearts, but I think more importantly, it made us angry. And Al asked if we wanted to do something about it. He said we talked about it for less than a minute and said, yes, let's.
And so how did that start off?
So Al came to that meeting already with his legal argument set and ready to go. And I'm sure most, if not all of you in this room could explain it, could probably know and can explain it better than me. But in a nutshell, in Ohio, first cousins cannot get a marriage license or get married. Same thing with an underage couple. However, if first cousins or an underage couple get a marriage license from a state where that type of marriage is legal and they get married, as soon as they cross the border into Ohio, Ohio recognizes that marriage as legitimate, as legal, and getting all of those rights, protections, and responsibilities. So our legal argument was simple. Ohio, you're creating separate classes of citizens by recognizing some out-of-state marriages but not others. So that was on Tuesday, we had that conversation. On Friday, 8 days after we got married, we filed suit in federal district court. Because of John's health, the judge it was assigned to, federal judge Timothy Black, had to clear his docket. And on Monday, 11 days after we got married, I was in court for the hearing.
And what's interesting about the case, and we talked about this last night, it was Obergefell versus Kasich,
Yes,
right?
so it was John Arthur and Jim Obergefell versus John Kasich and Mike DeWine. John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, and Mike DeWine, the attorney general. Well, shortly after, as things went on, they're like, and I like to say this, and I'm allowed to have this opinion, I think they're both cowards. They didn't want their names on this case. So they said, well, take our names off and put the head of the Ohio Department of Health on instead, because that department's responsible for death certificates.
And so that's how it became Obergefell versus Hodges, because of Richard Hodges, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, at the time, I think the head of the Ohio Department of Health changed a couple times over the course of the case. So there was Winslow, I think there was somebody else, and then eventually became Rick Hodges.
Okay.
And they also, of course, had to drop John's name after he died.
Right, and so you get married, I think it was July, correct?
July 11th.
11th, and then John passes away on October 26th, correct?
October 22nd, 3 months to the day after we won our case in federal court.
Oh, So he's there for that.
Yep, so he died 3 months later, but he died a married man.
Yeah, absolutely. So how? Oh. So we get to the Supreme Court because Ohio wasn't happy.
No, of course not. I mean, I think Ohio was more than anything annoyed that they couldn't appeal until after John died. It was a temporary restraining order, which they couldn't appeal until John died. And they would have appealed the day after they lost in federal district court if they could have. So they did appeal, and then our case was consolidated with another case that Al had that was around birth certificates. Al had 6 same-sex couples who'd either given birth in or adopted in Ohio, and they sued the state of Ohio as well for accurate birth certificates for their kids listing both parents' names. That case went before that same judge, Timothy Black, and he also ruled in their favor. So after John died, the state of Ohio appealed both of our cases, and we were consolidated with cases from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan, went to the Sixth Circuit, and in a 2-to-1 ruling, the Sixth Circuit ruled against us. So for me, that was the low point. You know, here the Sixth Circuit is saying, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Michigan, yep, you can continue to ignore or refuse to issue marriage licenses. You can continue to refuse to recognize these marriages. And Al said, Jim, do you want to keep fighting? And my response was an immediate, of course I am. If I don't, I'm not living up to my promises to John. And there was nothing that would prevent me from doing that. So the silver lining was when we filed cert with the Supreme Court, it was the first, there had been multiple circuit courts that had ruled in favor of marriage equality. This Sixth Circuit ruling was the first to rule against it.
Wow. Wow. So, so just to put that in perspective, right? So John's name's on the death certificate, and then...
Well, my name's on it, more importantly.
Right. Well, your name's on it. Yeah. So your
I shouldn't say more importantly, but that's what we fought for.
So your name's on the death certificate, and then Ohio was going to take it off of the death certificate.
Seriously, after the Sixth Circuit ruled against us, every time I checked the mail, I thought, is this the day I receive an envelope from the Ohio Department of Health with an updated death certificate saying John was unmarried when he died and not listing my name? And I will say, they did something petty to the parents and the kids in the birth certificate case. They sent updated birth certificates to those families, but they put an asterisk and a footnote at the bottom of those birth certificates saying pending legal case or something. But they wanted to make sure that those kids, those parents, knew that the state of Ohio still didn't consider them a family.
Wow.
But I never got an updated death certificate. But I was worried about it. Every single day I went to the mailbox.
And then eventually the Supreme Court grants cert, and it makes its way up to the Supreme Court. Now, here's an interesting story. This is why I want to do these type of programs, because you don't get to hear this part of it. How did these lawyers decide who's going to make the oral argument at the Supreme Court? Because I'm assuming all of them wanted to make the argument.
Especially civil rights attorneys. I mean, that's their dream. I want to go to the Supreme Court and argue in front of that body of judges, of justices. And this was no different. And, you know, I and the other Ohio plaintiffs, we were pushing for Al to be the one to argue the right to recognition in the Supreme Court. You know, by this point it had grown to, this case had more than 30 plaintiffs, more than 20 attorneys, and they very quickly all agreed on, we'll have Mary Bonato argue the right to recognition. Because the court said you have 2.5 hours, an hour and a half to argue the right to marriage, and an hour for the right to recognition. So the team very quickly said, we'll have Mary Bonato argue the right to marry. But then when it came to the right to recognition, we were pushing for Al. Al wanted to do it. But the Tennessee attorneys, they said, well, you know what? We really want to have someone who's argued in front of the Supreme Court previously. So they put forward Douglas Howard Dreimeyer. And the decision was, well, let's hold a moot court. So this team of attorneys invited any plaintiffs who wanted to be there to come, and I was there. And they had a 3-judge panel, well, 3 attorneys playing judges. Mary Bonato was one of them. And Al and Douglas Howard Dreimeyer both got to do a practice argument over the right to recognition. After they finished, they asked our opinion as plaintiffs and then said, okay, you need to leave because we're going to talk about this and decide. So after we left, they watched the videos. And the conversation began, who should argue in front of the Supreme Court. And Al just said, stop. He said, Douglas did a better job than I did. This is all about doing what's in the best interest of our plaintiffs. Douglas should argue in front of the Supreme Court, not me.
That's huge.
Yeah. And that's Al. Al never once put his ego, his dreams in front of doing what was best for his plaintiffs.
Were you present for the oral argument?
Yes, I had to be there. So I stood in line on the sidewalk in front of the Supreme Court to be in that courtroom for all 2.5 hours, and Aunt Tootie was with me. And I mean, I'll share two of my favorite memories from that. One, the gentleman who was sitting next to me, well, first off, they didn't know who I was. And it finally came out, and the guy sitting next to me said, Jim, I just want you to know, your and John's story really impacted my twin brother, who's a Roman Catholic priest. He called me this morning while I was on my way to the courthouse to say, Rob, I watched the story about the named plaintiff and his late husband, and it's made me rethink my opposition to marriage equality. A little while later, Rob is telling that same story to Aunt Tootie, but he said that our story changed two people's minds, and I thought, well, you told me about your twin brother, who's the other one? Then he turned back to me, shook my hand, and thanked me for doing the right thing, and then told me that he was an evangelical Republican. Yeah, I almost fell out of my chair. But to me, that was this moment when, wow, stories do matter. Stories change hearts and minds. And to me, I couldn't have asked for a more perfect example of the power of story. And my other favorite moment during oral arguments is when one of the justices brought up the argument that, you know, all of you fighting for marriage equality, you're trying to redefine marriage. Marriage has meant the same exact thing for millennia. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg jumped right in and said, I'm sorry, we already have redefined marriage because women are no longer the property of their husbands.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So oral argument takes place, and now we're getting down to decision day. And let's talk about decision day.
Yeah, so you know.
What day was decision day?
Well, I'll get there.
Okay.
So our oral arguments took place on April 28th. So when I left that courthouse that day, I knew I'm going to have at most 2 months to wait because their session ends in June. And all of the people who know the Supreme Court much better than I do said, Jim, if you want to be in the courtroom when the decision comes out, start coming back in mid-June because this is a major decision. They usually hold off on those. And the court will only initially say, we'll release decisions on Monday. So I was there Monday, June 15th, no decision. I was there Monday, June 22nd, no decision. We're standing outside of the courthouse that day on the 22nd, and somebody came running out to say, well, they just added Thursday, June 25th as a decision day. A couple minutes later, someone else came running out. They just added Friday, June 26th as decision day. And even at that point, we all looked at each other and said, it's going to be Friday, June 26th. But why? Well, United States versus Windsor, which struck down DOMA, came out on June 26th, 2013. Lawrence versus Texas, which struck down anti-sodomy laws, came out on June 26th, 2003. So we thought, this has to be a sign. So Friday, but I'm there again on the 25th, just to be sure. The 26th, I go back to the courthouse and took my place in line on the sidewalk, just like I had every time I'd been in that courtroom. And I'm number one in line, and the court officer comes by and hands out the tickets to be in the courtroom. And that had happened every other day I'd been there. And we're chatting, because a lot of the same people had been there, and we'd become friends, and we're chatting, and we're all holding our tickets, and I look down at my ticket, and I realize, oh, something has changed today. And I held it up and said, did you guys notice? Well, every day I'd been there, April 28th, June 15th, June 22nd, June 25th, that ticket was bright orange. Well, on Friday, June 26th, suddenly it wasn't bright orange.
What color was it?
Lavender. Like, this has to be a sign. I mean, to change color in the first place, when clearly orange was the color, and then of all colors, lavender, lavender law, the lavender scare, we took that as a good sign. So we go into the courtroom feeling pretty hopeful. Court comes to order, and the Chief Justice said, Justice Kennedy will read the first decision. And Justice Kennedy starts reading the summary decision, and my initial reaction is, we won, we won. And he kept reading. And yes, you attorneys, you don't write so that those of us who aren't attorneys can always understand it. And I found myself thinking, wait, did we win? I'm not sure. It sounded like it, but now I'm not really positive. And then it sunk in, yeah, Jim, you won. I burst into tears, and I could hear people around that courtroom sobbing. Al told me later he had never seen so many attorneys crying in a courtroom. And of course, my first reaction was, John, I wish you were here. I wish you could experience this. I wish you could know our marriage can never be erased. And then a split second later, I realized, oh, for the first time in my life as an out gay man, I feel like an equal American.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Yep.
That's powerful. So I remember seeing the scenes on the news, and it was like a party on the steps of the Supreme Court. And I'm thinking to myself, when we were talking last night, I was like, wait a minute. It's June, it's Pride Month. You're on the steps of the court, right? They've validated your marriage, right? You've got to go out and party.
Absolutely.
Right? So tell me.
Well,
was I right about that?
You'll all be jealous. So after court, we all gathered at the top of one of the sections of steps and had a press conference. And I spoke first, other people spoke, and then I got that phone call from President Obama, which was pretty darn amazing. And then I had lots of interviews. And then I went to the airport to fly home to Cincinnati because the Cincinnati Pride Parade was the very next day. I'm at the airport. My flight was scheduled, I think, around 5 p.m. And I'm in National Airport in D.C. And my flight's delayed. And my flight's delayed. And my flight's delayed. And at 1 a.m. Saturday, they canceled it. So while the whole country is celebrating, people are drunk everywhere. Queer bars have sold out of champagne. I spent the entire night by myself in National Airport. Oh well. But I did get home in time the next day to be in the Cincinnati Pride Parade. And then I went from the festival there to the airport and flew to San Francisco and was in the San Francisco Pride Parade the very next day.
But that parade had an effect on you, because we talked about this last night and you got a little emotional about it. Talk to me about it.
Yeah, so the Cincinnati Pride Parade was amazing and filled with joy because Cincinnati has changed. I mean, from the moment I moved to Cincinnati to that time, Cincinnati went through this incredible change. It was well known as the most gay-unfriendly city in the country because the people of Cincinnati in the mid-90s passed a ballot issue that amended the city charter, the city constitution, to say that no laws could be passed to protect the LGBTQ plus community. So we went from that to now suddenly the story, the named plaintiff in marriage equality is from Cincinnati. Cincinnati named a street after us. And here I am going through downtown Cincinnati, and people are just joyful. And I kept seeing this all the time. People in Cincinnati, this look of pride on their face because something good was finally coming out of Cincinnati. And then I went to San Francisco, and I sobbed that entire parade route. I mean, the sidewalks were filled with people, and so many of them were sobbing. And I know it was there were tears of joy, but a high percentage of those tears were for the loved ones they lost to AIDS. Not being there to experience that.
That's powerful. Powerful. Thanks for sharing. Appreciate it. And so San Francisco, so now, I didn't even get into this, Jim, and I completely forgot. So I read somewhere that you call yourself, before all of this, called yourself is it a checkbook?
Yeah,
What was that, checkbook?
Checkbook activist.
Activist, that's it.
Yeah, John and I weren't activists. If there was a cause we supported or an organization we supported, we were activists because we would write a check. That was it. And the only thing I ever did that was even remotely activism was that ballot issue I mentioned in Cincinnati in the mid-90s. I went to my polling place asking people to vote against it. That was it. Otherwise, John and I wrote checks.
But then after this, you become boots on the ground activist.
Yeah. Going through something like this has a profound impact. It changed me. I've also said I became an activist, but I was an accidental activist because of situations John and I found ourselves in. I mean, we could have never planned on DOMA being struck down, making this marriage happen in a medical jet, John's ALS diagnosis. None of that we could have planned or expected. The story, Al, it all just happened. It was accidental. But doing this and going to the Supreme Court and being part of such positive change in our country did change me profoundly. And now I consider myself a purposeful activist because I've lived firsthand something we're told as kids really is true. A small group of people really can change the world. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And you didn't just stop there. You ran for office.
Yeah. I lost my mind in 22 and ran for the Ohio House of Representatives. It wasn't really something that, I never in my life dreamt of. I was never one of those kids, I want to be president. God, no thanks. But I found myself thinking, this is a way for me to continue being active, to continue working to make things better. So I ran for the Ohio House in Ohio,
And they were so nice to redistrict you right out of
Right, they were so thoughtful.
Tell that story, please.
I announced my candidacy, and it actually happened to be on Martin Luther King Day. And my district looked one way, which is the way it had been for probably 3 or 4 election cycles. I announced, and then within a couple weeks, the redistricting commission released their new maps, and suddenly my district changed dramatically. They purposefully gerrymandered it so that I would not win, and I didn't. I would have won because my campaign manager went through the precincts in that original district, and I would have won.
Yeah.
But there's more I can do. So.
Absolutely. So after the run, then you do something that I love to do. And you officiate weddings.
I
right?
do, yes. So one of my friends, and this was before the decision, he said, Jim, I went online and I clicked the Ordain Me button, I officiate weddings. He said, have you ever thought about that? He said, I think some queer couples would love to have you officiate their weddings. No. So I did. Following in Aunt Tootie's footsteps, I went to the internet, clicked the Ordain Me button, and this past Labor Day weekend, I officiated what I think is my 30th wedding, which is nothing compared to you. But it's been such a joy, and it's been same-sex couples, opposite-sex couples. It's been around the United States. It's been in Europe, and I love it. It's so much fun to be part of that most important day for that couple.
And we talked last night about how that sense of joy, when you come to the wedding, everybody's happy.
Right.
It's a great environment. And I told you the story, and I know that Judge Trigiano, I think she was in the back. She's still there. And I remember when Obergefell came down, the decision came down. And that very next day, and Mary, you could vouch for this, there was a line out the courthouse, down the steps and around the corner. And judges were marrying everybody. It was just like everybody was out there just doing ceremonies.
I love it.
Doing ceremonies.
Yeah, it's been a joy, and I like to joke. It feels like a law was passed that when you get married now, you must include the last page of Justice Kennedy's decision.
Absolutely, because it used to be 1 Corinthians: love is patient, love is kind. Now it's Kennedy's decision. Absolutely,
no union is more profound than marriage.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So I have a connection to Jim, and it's a funny story. So I'm originally from Chicago, and I went down to go to a Bears game down in Chicago. Stop it. And so
Wait,
stop it.
Is that bouncy, kicky?
I know. Sport ball. So I'm at everybody's tailgating for this game, and I run into a guy I went to high school with. And he was like, hey, how you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm good. It's good to see you. I haven't seen you since high school. He's like, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm a judge up in Milwaukee. What are you doing? He's like, well, I own a winery. I'm like, what? That's amazing. He's like, yeah. So we start talking more. And he's like, well, I had a friend with me from here with me at the game. And I was like, hey, it's my friend Matt. He owns a winery. And Matt's like, no, I don't own it. I co-own it with someone else. And I'm like, really? Who do you co-own it with? He goes, Jim Obergefell. I'm like, what? and he's like, yes, that Jim Obergefell. And so you own a winery.
Yep. Yeah. Well, a wine label. So we took the easy way into the wine business.
Yeah,
we don't produce our own wine. We partner with winemakers and wineries and vineyards to make wine for us. And it's called Equality Vines. And this came about in 2015. So as Derek mentioned, Matt owned a winery. At that point, he owned a winery in South Africa.
Yeah.
And he imported and sold at like Costco and Kroger. And he was thinking about making a wine in memory of his Aunt Marilyn.
Which is, I have it up there just for you.
Yes, so the label on the left, the bright yellow one, it's get your own damn coffee, Chardonnay. And Matt was thinking about doing a wine to honor his Aunt Marilyn. She worked for NBC in New York in the 70s. She got as high as she could as a woman in that industry at that time. And one too many times, one of her male colleagues said, hey, Marilyn, get me a cup of coffee. And she'd had it. So she filed and led one of the first major class action lawsuits for gender pay equality in the workplace, Schultz versus NBC. Took about 6 years, but Aunt Marilyn and more than 300 other women at NBC received years' worth of back pay. She was also a lesbian. And Matt remembered, she died in, I think, 2012. She lived in Austin, Texas. And Matt remembered, as he's thinking about doing this wine, he thought, well, you know, there's so much happening right now. This is late 2014, early 2015. He's like, there's so much happening around marriage equality now. If I do this wine to support Aunt Marilyn, I remember that feeling when I realized her partner of decades meant nothing legally when Marilyn died. And that stuck with him. And he's like, maybe I'll just use this wine and make donations to the fight for marriage equality. So he Googled gay marriage. One Guess Whose face and name was the first thing that popped up. And then he realized we had his ex-wife and I had a friend in common. And he admits he cyber-stalked me, then tracked me down.
Yes, he does.
Tracked me down and cold called me and said, Jim, I have an idea for a business and I want you to be part of it. So we met in New York over dinner the very next day, even though he lived in San Diego, because he's like, I'd love to meet. And my response was, I'm free for dinner tomorrow. Can you be in New York? And he made it in one day. And we decided to launch this business, Equality Vines. And this label, it's premium wines, limited release, and every single wine supports an organization fighting for equality. So our wines currently support women's rights, queer rights, immigrants' rights, environmental equality, and we support lots of other things outside of that. And I only learned this in the past year and a half. When we decided to do this, in Matt's mind, he thought, I'll consider this business a success if we donate $100,000 to our partner organizations. We're over $250,000 at this point.
Awesome. And I'm just going to share another quick story. So I officiate a lot of weddings, and friends of ours. I don't know. Is Joshua and Caden here? I don't know if they're here. Oh, Caden's here. Caden, could you stand for 1 second? Yeah, Caden. So Joshua and Caden reached out and said, "Hey, would you officiate our wedding?" And so I said, yes. But I reached out to you, remember? And I said, I'm doing this wedding for my friends. I would love it if you would sign a bottle of your Love Wins rosé. And I cold called you at that point. I was ready to drop the Matt bomb, but I just cold called you. And you signed it and sent it out. Yep. And I gave it to Caden and Joshua for their wedding. And to top it off, it's their anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
I mean, you didn't know me, at all. And
right?
you said, yeah, not a problem.
Happy to do it.
And sent it out. It was amazing. Thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
I have the site up if anybody wants to take a picture with their phones to take a picture of the site. I actually, we've gone through a few of your bottles of wine. But there's something I do want to talk about before we go any further. And it has to do with your wedding ring. Now, your wedding band is special. Could you tell us why it's so special?
Yeah, so when we decided to get married, in my mind, I thought, we're going to go buy new rings. And John said, no, he's like, we don't need new ones. Let's just use rings we already have. And I had these 2 Mexican silver rings that I just bought in a flea market / antique market. So we decided to use those, especially because it was big enough to get over John's finger at that point. And so those were the rings we used. And then after John died, one of his friends from high school was our jeweler. And he said, Jim, have you ever thought about fusing the rings together? And then I can also cut a channel on the inside and insert some of John's ashes. So that's exactly what I did, and that's what you can see, the two rings fused together, and there's a channel on the inside with some of his ashes. And what I love is the museum in Washington, D.C., which was the museum about civil rights. Fortunately, it closed, but the very last special exhibition they did was all about life after Stonewall. And they had the wedding rings, they had the bow tie I wore on decision day, they had the jacket I wore when we got married, and they had one of our street signs. And then it went on tour. And I love this, I'm also loaning the rings, the bow tie to President Obama's library.
Oh,
yep.
Thanks for sharing that. Now, before I open it up for questions, I have one last thing I want to talk about. So as we talk about the case, and the purpose of this is to talk about the names behind the case, and we talked about Jim, of course, but there's another name on the case, and I showed you his picture before, Richard Hodges. But there's something you want to tell me about Richard Hodges.
Yeah, so when people think about a court case and there's that V, it's automatically assumed there's an adversarial relationship. Now, Rick, as I mentioned, was the head of the Ohio Department of Health. We are friends. Rick was on our side the whole time. And in fact, he tells me one of his first days on the job when he was appointed, someone came in and said, "Oh, and by the way, Rick, you're being sued by this guy named Jim Obergefell." And Rick's response was, "Well, who the hell is he and what did I ever do to him?" And that person said, "Well, it's the marriage equality thing." And he said, "Oh, no, you tell him, no, I'm good with this. We don't need to fight." But as the head of that department, he was just a name. He never once talked to the media. He never showed up in court. And within a year after the decision, I was friends with the then executive director of Equality Ohio. And she reached out. I was in Columbus for something. And she's like, "Now, Jim, any interest in meeting Rick Hodges?" And I said, "I don't know. Do I want to meet Rick Hodges?" And she said, "Yeah, I think you do." Met him that day. And he said, "Jim, I've never been happier to lose something." And the thing I love about him, as I mentioned, he never was in court, he never talked to the press, never did anything publicly against us because he was on our side. And then behind the scenes, as the head of that department, he had his team working as hard as they could to make sure that everything the Ohio Department of Health touches that is related to marriage, that's impacted by marriage, was set and ready to go for when he says, when we lost this case as we should. He wanted his queer employees to know that he was on their side. So he was doing everything he could so that they were ready to go. As soon as that decision came out, he could click send on an email. And that's exactly what happened.
And if you want to Google, there's a StoryCorps with Rick and Jim, and it's amazing. I was up too late last night listening to the whole thing.
I forgot about that. Thank you for that reminder.
Yeah, it's amazing. All right, I don't know. Are there any questions for Jim?
And I'm an open book, so don't be shy.
Hold on, we got a microphone coming for you.
Thank you. My question is, as you went through this process, if you met Evan Wolfson of the Freedom to Marry Act, and what was your first meeting with him like, and how did that experience go?
Yep. I absolutely do know Evan. We met during this case. Oh gosh, my memory's terrible. I think the first time I met Evan was actually at a rally in downtown Cincinnati in a park with a statue of Abraham Lincoln without a beard. It's one of the only few ones that are out there. But it was the night before our case went to the Sixth Circuit. And I think that's when I first met him, because Why Marriage Matters, that organization was the one who put that together. I think I just remember thinking, this man has done so much to help us move forward. Beyond that, no recollection. But yeah, definitely do know Evan.
Hi, Jim. This has been emotional. It truly is, your story. I was able to marry in Iowa before it was federal law, believe it or not, in Iowa.
Right.
But your case and your win validated my marriage, and I will forever remember that. But it just comes to mind that you said you were a checkbook advocate, but it was meant to be your advocacy. It is so powerful, and you've changed so many lives. how can you fight? I understand, because of your love, it exemplifies what marriage is all about and what you did. But how do you fight so fiercely and grieve at the same time? And I hate to ask this question, but I think it's so important, and it just shows how much strength you had and how much love you had for your husband.
Well, thank you for that. You know, people use the word courageous a lot, and I never felt courageous. To me, this wasn't a matter of courage. This was a matter of, well, damn it, we deserve to exist. It was as simple as that. And for me, continuing that fight, I mentioned this earlier, you know, even before we had the opportunity to marry lawfully in Maryland, we had made those promises over 21 years to love, cherish, and protect each other. And I wasn't willing not to do that. I promised John those things. And after caring for him as he lost every single physical ability, there wasn't anything I wouldn't have done for him. And people would always say, Jim, it must be really hard because you're talking about John all the time and reliving this. And I got to talk about him every single day. And what a gift that was. So being part of this case after he died, it helped my grieving process because he was alive for me in a way that I never expected. And I also got to see what our marriage, his death, and this fight meant to endless people everywhere I went. People crying, hugging me, shaking my hand, showing me photos. And honestly, one of the most impactful moments I've had, this was about 2 years ago. I spoke at the University of Tennessee, and a young woman came up to me and she said, Jim, I just want you to know if it weren't for marriage equality, if it weren't for your case, I would have committed suicide. I can't think of a better motivation to keep going. So thank you for that. I got to talk about him every single day.
Any other questions?
So as someone who is younger and queer, getting to grow up with your case and having that be something that I didn't have to experience, that I think that's a really amazing thing, and I really thank you for that because you leading the way really let me, you know, have hope for the future as a queer person. But I guess kind of my question, not to damper the mood because I think it's amazing, but as someone who's also a part of the trans community and everything, how do you continue to like fight? You know, how do you continue to like keep this going? Because it's like such a historic win and an amazing thing. But you know, like what even advice or like how do you continue to just like fight for these things when you know there's still so much work to be done?
Yep.
Just like, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And you know, kind of part of it goes back to the profound impact this fight had on me. I have to keep fighting. But it's also something I learned over the course of this. And, you know, our trans community is under attack. I mean, they're bearing the brunt of so much hate. And one of the realizations I had over the course of this was, you know what? I'm a white, cis, gay man. I went to the Supreme Court asking for the state of Ohio, our nation, to recognize my marriage to another white, cis, gay man. Well, you know what? I have no right asking for that if I'm not demanding that for every single other marginalized community. Everyone within the queer community, people of color. And that's one of the things I talk about a lot, and I'll be honest, I get really angry with the queer community because there's so much racism, misogyny, transphobia within our own community, and it infuriates me. How dare you say you deserve rights that you're not willing to demand for someone else? We've spent our lives being targeted, being demeaned, having our rights denied. How dare you do that same exact thing to somebody who happens to be different than you are? So that's what keeps me going. These days, honestly, there's a lot of anger and a lot of fear because of a certain Supreme Court justice who's put a target on marriage equality and on Lawrence and on the right to birth control, Griswold. So yeah, I guess right now, anger keeps me going. But it's also what you started with. You know, I hear a lot of people in our community say, you know, kids these days, they just don't understand what we went through. They don't understand what it was like 30, 40 years ago. Well, how on earth could they? They didn't live it. But you know what? Every single activist, what's at the heart of what we do is making the world better for the people who come after us. And nothing makes me happier than to know that young people today are growing up in a world where the question of their ability to get married and to have that relationship recognized is there. I want, in the future, for everyone to not experience a single thing that any marginalized community experiences now. That's the whole point of activism. That's the whole point of our country's long fight for civil rights. That's the whole point of We the People and equal justice under law. So that's what keeps me going. Knowing that I had the absolute honor and privilege of being part of making things better for people younger than I am, and my refusal to not keep fighting. So, thank you.
All right, we're at time, but Jim has been gracious enough to stick around and take
Absolutely.
pictures, answer questions. But Jim, thank you so much
Absolutely,
for
Barrett.
coming.
Thank you.
And I thank you all for coming as well. I really appreciate everybody coming out and spending this noon hour with us. Next week, we have another program on medical. We're going to talk about medical equity in the city of Milwaukee. So please take a look and register as well. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah, get over here.